Hello, everyone. For my first Classic Movie Monday, I decided to start off with something kind of random and kind of interesting and unique. And this film in particular, I think, is rather unique to the ones that I've reviewed so far, and I found it to have a huge significance in the movie-going community. So I figured, why not call it a classic, as what most people I think would like to call this film. At least critics and people who are huge fans of these styles and these kinds of movies, in particular Quentin Tarantino style. And this is largely Pulp Fiction. And Pulp Fiction is plays a huge role, sort of, in uh, Quentin Tarantino's movie career. As you can see, it's probably one of the more referenced films uh, out of a lot of the other films that he's done. It seems like this one in particular seems to grab a hold of people, and sometimes you can even tell that people will remember the name and, oh yeah, it's Quentin Tarantino, Pulp Fiction. They'll just automatically associate him with this film. Not only because he stars in it for just a little cameo, but also it sort of holds a framework as to the unique style that he was trying to go for. Because this film seems to offer something different than a lot of the other films were offering during the time. And that's to say that large part of it, I believe, has to do with the violence. Again, this is a very graphic film, and it does not shine away from being graphic. But what I like about Pulp Fiction is I don't think the violence is so oversaturated. I feel like that there's a lot of dialogue in between, so it doesn't feel like you're going from one scene of violence to the next scene of violence. So it knows when to bring in violence and when to have an actual scene that just involves two or multiple characters talking. So I think, though, in large part, a lot of people like to associate with the type of violence that it was trying to show, and how it can be grotesque, and even though I think Pulp Fiction is probably the best of Quentin Tarantino's, I think out of all of the films that I've seen of his, this one seems to be a little bit more downplayed with the violence. Because I've seen more only of his more recent films, like um, Django Unchained, as well as Inglourious Basterds, and those films seem to really up the violence to an nth degree. And with Pulp Fiction, I feel like it's fairly balanced, and although the violence is gruesome, it does seem to have a sort of significance to the story, and it doesn't feel like it's trying to emphasize a theme of revenge, which I've seen in a lot of Quentin Tarantino's movies. So I guess Pulp Fiction was rather refreshing for me personally. But besides my own personal opinion, I do want to bring to light that Pulp Fiction is famous for its violence. So if you do not like violence, I would suggest avoiding this film. But however, I do also consider Pulp Fiction to be a classic because um, it has this sense of style and understanding of dialogue and how people talk to each other. And I think this film really masters that approach. In a lot of films, you'll see how characters are really talking, and a lot of it has to do with the plot, a lot of it has to do with exposition, character development. But really, in this film in particular, a lot of the characters are talking about things that really don't revolve around anything that's going on really within the plot. Sure, they do have dialogue that does emphasize certain aspects of the plot, but there are certain things within the dialogue that are just so random and so out there that they don't really associate with a story so much or the overall plot that's going on. And I find that to be really refreshing, because I've seen a lot of films where a lot of it is focused in on the plot and the characters, but I like how in this film the dialogue feels so natural. It feels so like how actual people would talk with each other. When you see Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta's character talking in a car, which is probably, I think, one of the scenes that's within the opening, they really do emphasize this point of how this film is focused in on dialogue that doesn't necessarily have any relevance. But despite it not having any relevance, it's still interesting because it's how normal people talk. People talk about insignificant things all the time because people like to express themselves, and sometimes that involves bringing up random kinds of conversations that don't even really hold any relevance to what ends up really happening in their lives. It really plays with that so well. And when you see Samuel L. Jackson, John Travolta talking, I never feel like they're acting. I feel like that they're just actually having a conversation, and they're just actually talking, and they're actually trying to develop a conversation like any other people are. And that's why I think this film works so well, is because it knows how to use dialogue and the actors' emotions and expressions to the point where it feels very natural. It doesn't feel like they're trying to put on a performance, that they're trying to make you feel like that they are this character. It just comes through them like natural, and I just get so absorbed in the film because of that aspect, and that's why I find this film to be more interesting. I really don't get the whole violence approach. I guess it's just because that a lot of the films that were coming out during the time didn't really emphasize violence all that much. I mean, this film did come out in 1994, and there's been more films that were more focused on trying to be more clean and crisp, and this film was a little bit more edgy in its tone, so I guess that's why people like to associate with this film, because it came out during a time when people did not really have those films to watch. So that's why I think the violence plays a significant role with this film. But I really do feel that the dialogue and the way it is expressed by the actors really makes it shine, because it's not focused in on the plot. It's not focused in on character. It's just focused in on just having a conversation, just trying to get out this idea that these people are actual people, even though they're not. So I think that that's something that's really interesting, and that really captures me every time I see it. When John Travolta just brings up the Big Macs and he's just talking. He's not expressing anything that has any relevance, but it works so well because it comes off so natural, and it comes off in a way that you would think that this is how two people who are sitting in a car would talk. So that's how I feel this film, to me at least, gets the audience invested. I think a lot of it has to do with the dialogue, because violence can be found in any other film, but I think the dialogue really makes it shine. And not only is this expressed in a couple of scenes, or seems to be placed in one particular part of the film, it goes on throughout the film. You see this when Christopher Walken comes in and he does his whole speech about the watch and how it holds significance to Bruce Willis's character, but at the same time he admits stuff that he didn't even need to admit. That, like, he didn't even need to talk about it. That doesn't even hold any significance. But does it matter? No, because it's Christopher Walken going up and making this crazy speech, because we like seeing Christopher Walken do that, because he does that well. And he makes it seem like so natural, like that's just how the story went, you know? Um, and I think not only is it the dialogue and the way it's expressed by the actors that makes this film work well, I think it's also the fact that it does really well in splitting up the film into various parts, because you'll see how there's various storylines going on, but it all ties back together and it all makes sense. Like, it doesn't feel like um, you're seeing scenes that don't really go anywhere. They do lead eventually to something. They do wrap themselves up around in a nice big bow, but they also can be seen as little kind of vignettes where they're just um, where there's just two people talking, and you could just end the scene, and that's how you would view the film, as like a short film. So I think it works well separately as well as cohesively together. And I think that's why this film also gets this recognition and praise, because it knows how to do multiple things at the same time. And when you can do that with a film, that really makes it stand out. I think also the references to American culture hold some relevance. And it's not only when John Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson are talking about McDonald's. I'm also talking about the huge dance scene between Uma Thurman's character and John Travolta's character, where they enter themselves into a dance contest, and they're in this 50s style restaurant, and it really in that scene it really does emphasize that time period, that sort of style. And it seems to work really well, even though it doesn't take place during that time period. But there seems to be um, a lot of uh, significance put onto American culture within the film, and I think that's why a lot of people like to praise this film, because it seems to present itself in a way that's fairly um, Americanized, and since it takes place in the United States, it only makes sense that that culture is is put on the screen. And I like how it's presented in that sort of format of just these two characters just going into a diner and just talking. Um, I just think that works so well, and I enjoy when they talk, because they talk in even though they talk maybe more in a sophisticated way than maybe some people would associate these kinds of characters talking, because again, a lot of the characters within this film are considered to be really low on the pedestal, meaning they pretty much are criminals. So, um, but they do have this kind of sense of intelligence about them, and the way that they talk with each other just feels like how people within the situation that they would be put in would talk to one another. Is it a little bit over emphasized within the movie going community, this film? It might be. I can't really say as to whether or not that is. However, I do feel that I can understand the significance that this film has, in particular with the way it's set up, the style, as well as the dialogue. And I think the dialogue really just plays a big role, because it's I just love how it's just random. It has nothing to do with anything, but it holds relevance because it feels so human. Even though this isn't really a humanistic film at all, especially when you have tons of violence being thrown at you. But it is very human in the sense of how people talk to one another, and how uh, people relate to one another in various situations. You'll kind of see how John Travolta and Uma Thurman's character are kind of in an awkward position um, within the film, and you'll kind of see too how uh, Will Smith, or excuse me, not Will Smith, Bruce Willis sorry about that. How Bruce Willis's character is sort of making this huge transition in his life, and how he talks with one character is completely different, and how he treats another character. So there really is this um, emphasis, I think, on characters too, that makes this film significant. And I think a lot of that has to do with the dialogue, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that they don't really relate to anything, and that's okay because it still um, brings out the ultimate significance to the film, in that it is random, but it is all tied up together, and it holds some significance. It's just there's certain things that meander and go off topic, and that's okay because if it's done well, it can engage an audience, and I think that's why Pulp Fiction is so engaging to an audience, is because it can work itself in with the dialogue and make it feel very natural. So I guess ultimately that's really all I can say in regards to the significance of the film. If you want to know plot-wise as to how this film's structured, like I said, it kind of goes from scene to scene to scene, but then it ties everything up and there's these various storylines going on. And I really don't want to give any of that stuff away because that stuff I think is very significant to the whole story. And all you need to know is that if that Samuel L. Jackson, Bruce Willis, John Travolta, Uma Thurman, Christopher Walken, and Quentin Tarantino in a cameo, somewhat. I mean, yeah, he plays in like multiple scenes, but his character's just kind of there and then not there. But all those people are in this film, and they all, I think, do a good job in performing their characters, and they execute it really well with how they express the dialogue. And basically all these four storylines follow this kind of criminal activity and criminal related activity, and you'll see this throughout the film, how basically all of the characters are part of the crime lifestyle, you could say, or have someone who's or who are related to someone who is involved with that lifestyle. And you'll see how Bruce Willis's character is kind of trying to branch away from that, and how that plays a role into his part in this entire story, and how all of these other characters, including Samuel L. Jackson, John Travolta, Uma Thurman, and Christopher Walken, all tie into each other. And I think that's really the major strength of this film, is how it ties things together. It just weaves it all in such a way that is very intricate and very interesting, and something that's really not easy to do and to write. And I think Quentin Tarantino did a good job of executing that whole story and making little mini stories sort of out of it. So I guess I would say if you do enjoy the kind of scenes that do have some dialogue that kind of meanders, then you will enjoy this film. You will enjoy the meandering and the kind of randomness that comes up within this film. But if you are really strict with, okay, I want a plot, I want characters, I want an ending, I want to focus, this film doesn't really provide so much focus. I mean, it does give you ultimately a nice big bow at the end, but it does take its time to do that, because the dialogue is just sometimes not significant to getting to that main goal or main end. So if you kind of have a problem with that, that might be an issue that could come up. Personally, I found it very enjoyable and very refreshing because not a lot of films do it. So this is why this film is probably considered classic, because none of these films have done these kinds of forms of dialogue where it's just kind of random, it's kind of out there, It's not really meant to be taken seriously or as part of the plot or characters. It's just there to show you that uh, that this is how people in the real world talk, even though we're not in a real world type setting. Uh, but I think without giving too much away, that's really all I can say plot-wise. But overall, I think it's a satisfying film. Again, if you don't mind the violence, if you don't mind the meandering, and you like this kind of vignette formula that ties itself eventually all around together, then I think you will find Pulp Fiction very enjoyable. However, if you do not like those things that I've mentioned, then you probably might be best to sticking to a traditional type classic. And this is definitely not a traditional type classic film. And not all the films that I'm going to review are considered traditional type classics. So I thought it would be interesting to start off with something that's rather unique, and I think Pulp Fiction is one of those films. It does have this unique style and unique way of telling a story that I don't think a lot of films do, and I think that the reasons that I've explained really highlight that. But again, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them, but I think ultimately that is all I can say about Pulp Fiction. I hope that if you consider watching the film that you do, and if you are not a huge fan of this kind of film style, then that's totally fine. I personally enjoyed it, and I consider it to be a classic. So that's really ultimately all I can say. But take care, everyone, and I hope to see you tomorrow, where I'll be talking about something with music. I am not sure what, but I hope it to be interesting. But that's, I believe, all I can say. But take care.